Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about the HOA that wants me to give them the extra rooms of my house. I didn't grow up with a lot of luxuries, so the idea of finally owning a house felt like the pinnacle of personal success. When I was in my mid-20s, I decided that I would eventually work hard enough to move closer to the ocean. My father used to tell me, if you ever can, live near the water. It changes your entire perspective on life. That dream stuck with me. And by my early 30s, I managed to save enough for a down payment on a beautiful place near the sea. It wasn't a massive house by estate standards, but it had 5 rooms and ample space for someone like me who loves having friends and family visit. Even with my parents coming for a week every month or out-of-state friends turning up randomly because they love the beach, I still had a spare room or two. It was precisely what I wanted. I never expected that this simple decision, to buy a 5-room house and live in it mostly on my own, would spark so much controversy with an overly nosy neighbor, a petty HOA, and lead to a bizarre situation where someone actually called 911 on me over my house keys. From the day I moved in, I realized the neighborhood had a homeowners association with an interesting set of rules. I'd never lived under an HOA's governance before, and at first I thought it might be fine. Perhaps some basic regulations to keep the community neat and ensure property values remained stable. How wrong I was. The weekend after I closed on the house, I tried to introduce myself to a few neighbors while unloading boxes from the moving truck. Most people were perfectly nice, greeting me warmly, asking normal questions like where I'd moved from and what brought me to the area. One or two, however, gave me strange looks, particularly when I mentioned that I lived alone. I remember one neighbor, a woman named Belinda, responding in a perplexed tone, "Why would a single person need so much space?" At the time, I chalked it up to curiosity, or maybe a local culture that prized more compact homes. I shrugged it off. It wasn't until a week later that I got my first real taste of the HOA's meddling nature. While I was relaxing on my small back patio, sipping coffee and admiring the ocean breeze, I heard a knock on my door. I opened it to find a man wearing a polo shirt embroidered with the association's emblem. He introduced himself as Garvey, an HOA board member. He seemed slightly uneasy, fidgeting with a clipboard as he explained he was doing a routine check to ensure new homeowners understood the neighborhood guidelines. At first, I didn't suspect anything out of the ordinary. I invited him in, not realizing I was about to open a Pandora's box of petty requests and outlandish demands. Once inside, Garvey glanced around my living room and the short corridor leading to the guest rooms. He took quick notes while peering over his clipboard. Then he casually mentioned, "We noticed you have a 5-bedroom setup here. Do you live here alone?" I nodded, explaining that I've always hosted guests, sometimes my parents, sometimes old college friends, sometimes acquaintances looking for a weekend at the beach. He raised an eyebrow and said, "Well, that's a lot of space for just one person. We've got some concerns about safety and property usage. There's a rule in the HOA about not exceeding occupancy or using spaces for commercial purposes." I politely clarified that I wasn't running an Airbnb, nor was I housing random renters. These were friends and family visiting me. I offered to show him my guest room arrangement so he'd see it was perfectly normal. He nodded but seemed oddly fixated on the idea that one occupant shouldn't have that many vacant rooms. After about 15 minutes of walking through the house and answering every question about the dimensions, the floor plan, and how often guests would stay, I thought we were done. Then he took me by surprise. He said, "We also have a policy that the HOA keeps a spare key to every property in case of emergencies or maintenance issues when the owner is away. You'll need to provide a key for each lock on your doors, including your interior doors if they lock separately." Immediately, I felt my gut clench. I'd never heard of any HOA requiring keys to every single door, let alone the main entrance, but apparently it was part of their standard practice. I told him politely that I was uncomfortable handing over the keys to all my doors. If they needed emergency access, the local emergency services or a locksmith could handle it. But he insisted that it was a mandatory rule. "We keep them locked up safely in the HOA office," he said. "This is standard procedure to ensure the safety of the community and the homeowner." I asked to see this rule in writing. He rifled through his clipboard and provided me with a handbook referencing the association's rights in an emergency. However, the language was vague at best. It mentioned authorized entry for urgent repairs and access code or key for common facilities. But nowhere did it say I was required to surrender my private keys to every single door. I wasn't comfortable, so I refused. I explained it violated my sense of privacy. He stared at me in dismay and said, "Well, we might have to escalate this. Nobody in this neighborhood refuses that policy. It's for your own protection." My instincts warned me something was off, but I remained polite, thanked him for his time, and firmly said I would not be handing over the keys. That evening, I found a notice taped to my front door from the HOA. It repeated the demand that I provide keys to the main entrance, along with keys for any locked areas within the property, or risk fines. Fines, I read it 3 times to ensure I wasn't misunderstanding something. It threatened a daily charge if I didn't comply within 10 days. I couldn't believe it. Out of pure frustration, I decided to consult a neighbor 2 doors down, a jovial older man named Ray, who had casually mentioned he'd been in the neighborhood for over 20 years. If anybody would know, it was him. Ray was stunned. He told me that while the HOA had made certain moves toward controlling everything in the past, no one had ever heard of them demanding keys to the entire house. He'd never even heard that they demanded the main door key. "I think they're targeting you because they think you're an easy mark," Ray speculated. "They see a single occupant with a big place. Maybe they're hoping you don't know your rights." The next day, I called a local property attorney for a quick consultation. The attorney practically laughed when I described the situation. He assured me that, from a legal standpoint, no private organization can force me to hand over the keys to my own home unless there was a clear, explicit clause in the contract I signed when I purchased the property. If any such clause were hidden in the HOA's document, it would be flagged as highly unusual and potentially unenforceable. Armed with this knowledge, I decided I'd stand my ground. I informed the attorney that I was going to refuse and see what steps they took next, and he advised me to keep a record of all communication. Predictably, the HOA kept sending me letters. Every couple of days, there'd be a slip in my mailbox, referencing fines or threatening to escalate the matter. I never paid those fines, didn't even entertain the possibility, and kept politely insisting that they show me the exact clause that granted them this power. This dance continued for several weeks, and meanwhile, I tried to live a normal life. I worked remotely, so during the day I'd be inside at my desk, tapping away at my laptop, and at night I'd take walks by the shore, letting the salty breeze calm my nerves. During this time, my parents decided to pay their monthly visit. They typically come to stay for about a week, enjoying the mild weather and using my house as a base to explore local shops and museums. My mother, a retired teacher, loves the chance to see the ocean. My dad loves to fish. They contribute to the upkeep of the house while they're here, and they're genuinely excited about my place. On the 3rd day of their visit, I woke up to find a man on my property, peeking in my back windows. Alarmed, I opened the sliding glass door and demanded to know what he was doing. The man was the same neighbor, Garvey, the HOA board member. He claimed he was just verifying that all safety measures were in place. I told him in no uncertain terms he was trespassing, and that if he had concerns, he should file them in writing. He muttered something under his breath and stomped off. As if that wasn't enough, 2 days later, I caught another neighbor, a younger guy named Trevor, pacing around my driveway. He saw me come out and gave a mock-friendly wave. Then he said, "If you just followed the rules, we wouldn't have to be so vigilant. The HOA is simply trying to do its job." My father overheard and stepped out, letting Trevor know we were quite capable of managing our own locks. Trevor looked taken aback by my dad's firm tone. He left quickly, but I had a sense that tensions were building. I tried to focus on everyday life, reminding myself that people can be nosy or petty, but they rarely escalate beyond petty gestures. Then, after my parents returned home, a more dramatic incident took place. I was asleep late one Sunday morning when I heard frantic banging on my front door. I stumbled out of bed to find my next-door neighbor, a person I'd never had any issues with until that point, standing on my porch with a phone in his hand. Let's call him Caden. He was breathing heavily, as if in a panic. "I'm calling 911 if you don't give me the keys," he shouted through the door. Confused, I opened the door just a crack, leaving the chain latched. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Caden was practically shaking with a weird mix of anger and mania. "I told Garvey that I'd get the keys from you if you refused again," he shrieked. "We are not letting some weird occupant with extra rooms break the community rules. Hand them over." I'll never forget the sense of surreal disbelief I felt in that moment. This man, a neighbor I barely knew, was threatening to call the police on me for not giving him my house keys. He was acting like I'd done something criminal by refusing to let the HOA have unlimited access to my private property. I calmly told Caden to leave my property or I'd call the police myself. He started dialing on his phone, and I heard him say, "I need officers right away. My neighbor is violating the HOA laws, and we need immediate help." He's refusing to comply. It was so absurd. I slammed the door and locked it. A part of me wondered if the police would even bother to show up, given how nonsensical the claim was. But about 15 minutes later, sure enough, I saw flashing lights outside my window. 2 officers approached my door. I opened it carefully, making sure to keep my phone's camera recording in case I needed evidence. The officers were polite and professional. They told me they received a call that there was a dispute involving trespassing and possibly illegal modifications of the house. I calmly explained the entire situation. I also showed them the letters from the HOA and the attempts by certain neighbors to force me to hand over my keys. The officers listened, looking more confused by the minute. "This is a civil matter, not a criminal one," one officer eventually told Caden, who was standing nearby with his arms crossed. "We can't enforce any rule about giving keys to a private organization. That's beyond our jurisdiction." Caden seemed enraged, pointing repeatedly at my house and sputtering, "He's not following the community rules. He's got 5 rooms and he's just one person. He doesn't need them all." The second officer gave him the kind of look you'd give a toddler throwing a tantrum. Then the officer turned to me and said, "As far as I can tell, you're not violating any laws by refusing to hand over your property keys. Are you comfortable with us leaving now, or do you feel threatened?" I admitted I was uneasy about the neighbor's behavior, especially with him banging on my door early in the morning. The officer offered to document everything in a report. They warned Caden that if he continued to harass me, I could file a restraining order or press charges for harassment and trespassing. That cooled Caden down, at least outwardly. He muttered something about taking it up with the HOA, then left. You'd think that moment would have been a wake-up call for the HOA. If the police come out and say, "This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. We can't force him to give you keys," that might be the end, right? But no. Over the next week, I received daily notices from the HOA office. They claimed I owed hundreds of dollars in fines, and they were going to place a lien on my property if I didn't comply. They cited obscure sections of the HOA agreement that talked about cooperative compliance for community safety. It was nonsense. I forwarded all these letters to my attorney. He compiled them into a stack and drafted a formal cease and desist notice. He also included a statement that if they attempted to file a fraudulent lien, I would not hesitate to sue them for damages and legal fees. At that point, my attorney discovered that their so-called rule about handing over keys wasn't something that had been voted on by the community. It was a guideline the current board had tried to slip into the updated bylaws a few years back, but never properly ratified. Meanwhile, more personal tensions erupted. As the HOA drama played out, I found out from Ray that Garvey, the board member who had originally visited my home, was telling people that I was running an illegal hostel and possibly engaging in suspicious activity. Ray heard this gossip at a local diner, where Garvey was complaining loudly that I was some sort of reclusive troublemaker. Ray defended me, saying, "He's just a private homeowner who likes his privacy. Back off." But rumors persisted. A few neighbors started giving me the cold shoulder. Others, however, started to become suspicious of the HOA's tactics. 2 different families approached me privately, confiding that they too had faced strange pressure from the board. One family said they'd been fined for having a small dog, even though the HOA rules specifically allowed pets under a certain weight limit. Another said they were threatened for having a decorative statue in their front yard that apparently wasn't architecturally harmonious. In the midst of all this, my parents scheduled their next monthly visit. I gave them a heads up that the neighborhood was tense and asked them to be vigilant. My mother, always the peacemaker, tried to reason with me that maybe there was some compromise, but my father was resolute. "You don't let random people hold the keys to your home. Period." When they arrived, I noticed a few residents walking by, staring at them unload their car as if it were suspicious that my parents came to stay. My dad even joked, "I guess they think we're smuggling contraband." But inside, I could tell he was furious that anyone would violate our family's basic right to privacy and property. Sure enough, 2 days later we had another incident. Someone from the HOA, no idea who, posted a notice on my door while we were out. It stated that I was under active investigation for potential neighborhood covenant violations, and that the house would be inspected in the coming week. Inspected! They threatened that if I didn't cooperate, they would escalate the matter to local authorities. My parents read the notice with disbelief. "Is this some sort of harassment campaign?" my mom asked, bewildered. It certainly felt that way, so I contacted my attorney, who quickly fired off another letter. This time he made it clear that any unauthorized attempt to enter my property would result in immediate legal action. If they wanted to inspect, they needed to produce actual legal grounds or demonstrate a clause in the contract that allowed them an invasive search. Otherwise, they should back off. As the tension grew, I tried to keep myself sane by focusing on my work and enjoying the beach in the evenings. My father and I took a long walk by the water, discussing next steps. He suggested that if the HOA persisted, maybe I should attend the next general meeting and call them out in front of the community. It was a solid idea. So, about a week later, I showed up at the monthly board meeting with a folder of every letter, notice, and email exchange, plus statements from neighbors who'd been bullied as well. My plan was to speak calmly, present facts, and see if the broader membership would realize how overreaching these board members were. When I arrived at the meeting, I noticed a handful of neutral or supportive neighbors. Ray was there, giving me a thumbs up from the back row. On the board dais sat Garvey, plus 2 other members, and an older woman who rarely made eye contact. The meeting started off with typical agenda items: upcoming landscaping projects, budgets for community pools, mundane items. Then the floor opened for community concerns. I approached the microphone and introduced myself. I began by stating I had received multiple letters from the HOA demanding I hand over my private keys, including interior doors, which was never a properly ratified rule. I also mentioned the attempted trespass and the false police call. I showcased my attorney's responses to their repeated threats. As I spoke, I could see some people in the audience exchanging shocked glances. The woman to Garvey's left was frowning deeply. Suddenly, Garvey interrupted, trying to spin the situation. He claimed that the keys were needed because I was not maintaining the property and that I was creating an unsafe environment. I calmly asked him to specify how. He had no answer. I then turned to the community members and pointed out that I kept my house in pristine condition. No noise complaints, no hazards, and certainly no subletting. I ended by saying, "What's unsafe is a policy that attempts to strip away a homeowner's right to privacy. I refuse to comply with such an illegal and morally questionable demand." People started muttering. A few applauded. Then someone asked Garvey where in the bylaws this key requirement was located. He tried flipping through a binder but couldn't find it. Another member asked if we'd ever voted on it. No one could recall any such vote. The older woman on the board finally spoke up. "I don't remember any official discussion about collecting keys to private residences. That seems beyond our scope." This comment really rattled Garvey. He started stammering about special provisions and emergency protocols, but it was obvious he was making it up as he went. Sensing the board was turning against him, Garvey ended the conversation abruptly, saying, "We'll revisit these policies at another time." He tried to move on to the next topic, but the damage was done. After the meeting, I was approached by at least 7 or 8 residents. One was outraged to learn that the HOA board had been threatening me. Another said, "They tried to pull something similar with me last year. I was so stressed I didn't fight back, but I'm glad you are." People seemed genuinely supportive. Word spread quickly that the HOA board's attempts to demand keys were baseless. Meanwhile, Garvey avoided me altogether. It was a small victory, but I knew the board might continue to harass me. Sure enough, a week later, I received an envelope in my mailbox, no return address. Inside was a typed note reading, "Just give up, you're outnumbered." It creeped me out, but I didn't let it rattle me too much. My attorney advised me to keep it as evidence in case a harassment case ever became necessary. For a while, things quieted down, with no new letters or ridiculous notices. Maybe the board realized they were in the wrong. I enjoyed a month of relative peace, had more guests visit, and my parents came for their usual stay. Everything felt normal, until Caden reemerged. I was driving home from grocery shopping one afternoon and saw Caden standing by my front door, trying to peek inside through the side windows. He saw my car pull up and sped off, pretending he was just walking by. I had half a mind to confront him then and there, but I decided not to. When I checked my door, there was a piece of paper taped to it. Another bogus violation notice claiming I was storing personal watercraft, a boat or jet ski, in an unauthorized zone. It accused me of having an unregistered vessel behind my house. I didn't even own a boat or a jet ski, so this was nonsense. I realized they were just trying to build some sort of paper trail of complaints, no matter how false, to justify further action. My temper flared. Instead of letting it slide, I marched inside, scanned the bogus violation, attached it to an email to the HOA board, and CC'd my attorney. I wrote, "This claim is blatantly false. I own no watercraft. You are hereby on notice that continued false accusations and harassment will be met with legal action." Then I added that if anyone trespassed on my property again, I would immediately call the police. Ray told me that was the right call. He suspected the board was unraveling, grasping at straws to avoid admitting wrongdoing. Unbeknownst to me, though, the final straw came from within the HOA itself. One of the board members who had remained silent decided he'd had enough. He resigned from the board and then leaked internal emails to several homeowners, including me. These emails showed that Garvey was the mastermind behind the key demand, claiming it was necessary to keep an eye on suspicious residents. The emails also revealed Garvey's personal vendetta. He had grown up in a big family, never had space to himself, and apparently disliked the idea that I, a single guy, could enjoy an entire 5-room house so close to the beach. It was beyond petty. It was personal envy. He had weaponized his position on the HOA board to push these demands. Enraged by this revelation, I turned over all the emails to my attorney. He immediately prepared a formal complaint and threatened to sue both Garvey personally and the HOA as an entity, citing harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of privacy. He sent copies to each board member. The community erupted when these emails circulated, and a special meeting was called to address the scandal. That meeting was intense. People were livid that Garvey had turned personal jealousy into an official policy that harassed an innocent homeowner. Several neighbors demanded Garvey's resignation. He tried to bluster his way out, claimed everything was taken out of context, but the writing was on the wall. The board voted him out that very evening, and the membership cheered when it was announced that Garvey no longer held any position of authority. With Garvey gone, there was a flurry of attempts at damage control from the remaining board members. They apologized profusely for the misunderstanding and tried to retract all fines and notices they had sent me. They also asked that I sign a statement promising not to sue them. My attorney advised me to wait and see if they had truly learned their lesson, or if they were just trying to cover themselves. Meanwhile, Caden, who had called 911 and banged on my door demanding keys, received a formal warning from the new board for inappropriate conduct. Several neighbors who had initially sided with Garvey turned their backs on Caden once the truth came out. Faced with public embarrassment and potential legal consequences, he retreated into his home and rarely emerged. At this point, I had a decision to make: pursue a lawsuit for the harassment, or try to move forward without further legal entanglements. My attorney said that I had a strong case, but it might drag on for months or even years. I was tempted not because I wanted money, but because I wanted to set a precedent that nobody should be allowed to weaponize an HOA to violate basic property rights. Ultimately, I decided to hold off on immediate litigation, but I refused to sign any document that absolved them of responsibility. I told the new board, if this ever happens again, I will not hesitate to use every legal resource available. A few weeks later, the new board hosted a neighborhood barbecue, inviting everyone and encouraging folks to bring their concerns openly. I attended, partly out of curiosity, partly to see if there was a genuine shift in the community's atmosphere. Ray was there, smiling wide and shaking my hand, saying he was glad the tyranny was over. A few board members approached me, shook my hand, and apologized personally. They seemed sincere. They said they were discussing ways to revise the bylaws so no single board member could slip in new rules without a community vote. I considered that a victory for everyone who valued privacy and fairness. Meanwhile, life at my house slowly returned to normal. My parents came for their monthly stay, and this time no one bothered them. No one peered in my windows, and no phony violation notices appeared. I hosted a couple of friends from out of town, and for the first time, I felt I could do so without the specter of some nosy neighbor jumping to the conclusion that I was running an illegal operation. When I strolled along the beach with my guests, a few neighbors smiled and waved. It was a stark contrast to the tension that had dominated my first months here. One surprising but positive outcome was that a small group of homeowners banded together to reform certain parts of the HOA. They set up a transparent system, posted meeting agendas online, and required majority votes for any new guidelines. It's not perfect, but it's leaps and bounds better than before. Ray told me that in all his years living here, he'd never seen such a shift toward open governance and resident-driven decision-making. He half-jokingly credited me, saying, "Sometimes it takes one stubborn person to stand up to bullies to change the whole system." As for the neighbor who called 911, Caden kept a low profile for a long while. Rumors circulated that he might move, but he hasn't yet. I occasionally see him dart inside his home or speed off in his car. We don't talk, and I'm perfectly fine with that. The police incident remains a sore memory, but I took comfort in knowing that his attempt to weaponize law enforcement over something so ridiculous backfired spectacularly. If anything, it caused the community to side with me once the truth came out, and it forced an overdue reckoning with the abuses of the HOA leadership. I never did give anyone my keys, main door, bedroom door, or otherwise. Despite the initial hostility, I still love my house. Owning 5 rooms, having ample space for my folks to visit for a week each month, and hosting friends has brought me a sense of fulfillment. I find that my quiet moments by the ocean are even sweeter now that I've emerged victorious from this ordeal. There's a certain satisfaction that comes from knowing I stood firm for my rights, and that decision led to a ripple effect improving the entire neighborhood. In time, I noticed a few new residents moving in. When I see them, I offer a friendly welcome. 1 or 2 have shyly asked if they should be worried about the HOA. I'm honest with them. This place had issues, but things are getting better. If you ever have trouble, just remember you own your property. Don't be afraid to stand up for your rights. I think sharing that knowledge is important, because too many people assume HOAs have absolute power. My parents joke that their monthly stays have turned them into part-time citizens of this little seaside community. They've got a circle of acquaintances now, especially among the older residents. My mom befriended a woman down the street who runs a little bakery from her home. My dad found a couple of fishing buddies. It's a testament to how everyday life can be normal and pleasant, even if the official board or a handful of busybodies try to stir up trouble. I still have all the documentation from that bizarre time in a thick folder marked HOA nonsense. The attorney advised me to keep it for at least a few years in case any remnants of Garvey's influence resurface. Garvey himself disappeared from public view after being ousted. I heard through the grapevine that he tried to get on the board of another local community association, but was rejected once they heard about his fiasco here. In a rare moment of comedic relief, I saw Caden trudging along the sidewalk a couple of months ago, balancing groceries, clearly trying to ignore me. He looked visibly uncomfortable. Part of me felt a small pang of pity, but then I remembered how he'd tried to bully me, calling 911 over something so absurd. I'm not one to hold grudges forever, but I can't forget how he attempted to have me arrested just because I refused to bend to an irrational demand. Life's too short to harbor resentment, but it's also too short to allow that kind of toxic behavior to go unchecked. Friends, thank you. See you soon.